5 centuries ago, when the Spanish conquistadores marched through Latin America in search of golden treasure and pagan souls to save for Christianity, they discovered and defeated the Inca Empire, a complex monarchy that held sway over much of Peru and western South America. The Inca chiefs, so rich and powerful, were believed to have ruled since the beginning of time. Little did the Spanish realize the Incas were newcomers, recent participants in a 3,000-year pageant of conquest and civilization, of warfare and cultural achievement. Entire societies had vanished long before the Inca Empire began. Centuries before the Inca, a people we now call Moche, flourished not in the mountains, but on the adjacent coastal plain of northern Peru. The Moche lived in one of the world's driest deserts. Clouds from the ocean rarely bring rain. Usually they float over these lowlands to the Andes Mountains that loom above and to the east. Or else they hang as haze during the warm summer months. The area is watered by rivers that cut across the coastal plain as they drain rainfall from the mountains back into the sea. Like Peruvian farmers today, the Moche diverted these streams to supply their daily needs and irrigate their crops. Besides supporting agriculture, these rivers and the Pacific Ocean into which they flow provide a wealth of natural resources. Here, in floodplain and river valley, marsh and delta, the Moche ruled for 7 centuries, from shortly before the time of Christ until well past 600 AD. The Moche had no written language. They left no books telling of their ideas and exploits. But the arid climate has preserved much of what they created. Though made of mud brick, many Moche structures are still standing after 1,400 years. Rain has scarcely damaged their beautiful murals. Even the refuse of their daily lives is well preserved. All this gives archaeologists a rare opportunity to reconstruct the distant past. These deep deposits tell about Moche economic life. The abundance of tiny cobs indicates they grew corn. They also planted beans, squash, sweet potatoes, manioc, avocado, and peanuts. Bones from these ancient garbage dumps show the Moche raised llamas, ducks, and guinea pigs, and hunted deer, wild birds, and sea lions. Stone net weights like this imply that fishing provided another important source of protein. The Moche buried their dead in graves dug into dry hills close by their settlements. Most graves contain a single individual surrounded by an array of burial goods. An opened grave can reveal their skill at metalworking, basketry, weaving, and wood carving. Yet most would agree that the ceramic vessels which accompany nearly every burial are the culmination of Moche artistic achievement. Moche potters portrayed many individuals. They also drew inspiration from the natural environment. They even show us their deities and demons. Many pots are decorated with scenes of Moche life. When these curved paintings are reproduced on a flat surface, they give us a glimpse into the daily activities, grand ceremonies, and sacred mythologies of the people who created them. Careful examination of Moche art suggests that it was not merely ornamental, but served as a means of communication. Since the Moche left no written texts, we must learn to read their pottery. However, we should avoid imposing our own ideas on the objects and actions we see depicted. If we are really to discover the Moche, we must always read their art on its own terms. For instance, this piece does not simply represent two stacked bowls filled with peanuts. Instead, research has shown that stacked containers imply a symbolic offering of food presented only on ceremonial occasions. Rather than guess at the meaning of Moche ceramics, we can often interpret the pots by combining what they appear to suggest with information obtained by scholars from other sources. Archaeology expands what we learn from the pots by providing actual examples of what the artists portrayed. While several pots indicate that the Moche constructed buildings with sloped and gabled roofs, topped by club-shaped ornaments, only the archaeological remains can tell us they were made of sun-dried mud brick, a material well suited to the desert environment of the Peruvian north coast. Large, circular ear ornaments like those worn by this figure are sometimes found in graves of individuals who were buried wearing them. We can also learn about Moche art by observing Peruvians today. Much of what the potters recorded can still be seen in Peru. The llama remains a Peruvian beast of burden. its pack bags still resemble those shown in the ceramics. Modern weavers show us how the Moche may have made their cloth. They ply their trade on looms identical to those the Moche used. The boats shown on several pots mirror the reed craft that continue to be used along the seacoast. Boatmen even use oars of split cane, very similar to the paddles drawn by the potters. Moche musical instruments correspond well to the drums and flutes played today. And this coca-chewing Indian is matched by an ancient Moche jar. Healing is another popular Moche theme, best understood by analogy to current folk medicine. This owl shaman carries strands of espingo seeds. These seeds are sold in modern Peruvian herb markets to help treat people who have lost their souls because of extreme fright or shock. Here, a female shaman holds a section of the San Pedro cactus, a plant that contains mescaline. Curers still make San Pedro into a drink which they use as a central part of their healing ceremony. Eduardo, a Peruvian shaman, prepares San Pedro at noon to take during an all-night curing session.
Arronera adentro, entalgos encanto, en mi buena cuenta, lo vengo llamando. Y cerro rajado, perreña hacia adentro, donde voy juntando, guambo va jugando. Y así voy contando, todo por encanto.
At midnight, he fights off the demons revealed by the hallucinogenic mescaline. Eduardo keeps his magical gear on a cloth or mesa, known by all to be the shaman's sacred territory. The mesa's importance to modern shamans has led to an entirely new interpretation of this Moche figure, who holds several ceramic containers and a rolled mat. Formerly thought to be a vendor of pots, more likely he is a shaman carrying his paraphernalia. In fact, he seems to be whistling just like shamans do today as part of their ceremony. Once understood, most Moche pots are alive with ceremonial events. This scene, a sea lion hunt, would seem to be an ordinary activity for a coast-dwelling people. However, Eduardo has said that the dots in front of the animals represent small stones still sought by hunters today. These stones, which are sometimes coughed up when the sea lions are clubbed, or are found in the animals' stomachs, are then used by folk healers as powerful ritual objects. Recently, we have discovered several rare 16th and 17th century Spanish manuscripts that speak of Indian life in Peru as it was at and even before the time of the Spanish conquest. We can combine these historical accounts with Moche pottery to reveal new aspects of Moche culture. Several pots depict figures seated on a mysterious floating platform. Modern Peruvians use reed boats and never rafts. However, the early Spanish writer, Garcilaso de la Vega, notes that the Indians of his time made rafts of large whole gourds, enclosed in a net and tied strongly together. In front, they put a leather sling shaped like a saddle, into which the Indian raftsman puts his head and commences to swim. As he swims, he pulls the raft with its cargo. A wealth of information on Indian belief and practice during the early years of Spanish Peru is found in the writings of Father Antonio de la Calancha, a little-known Augustinian monk. Calancha says that long before his own time, curers were high public officials who were paid by the state. If they lost their patients through negligence, however, they were killed and left lying on the ground to be eaten by birds, while the patient was ceremoniously buried in a deep pit grave. This Moche drawing appears to illustrate just such an event. One individual, presumably the doctor, is on the surface of the ground being consumed by birds, while the patient, in a box-like casket, is lowered into a deep grave. Father Calancha also speaks of Moche the Lousy, a notorious witch covered with lice who lived in northern Peru long before the Spanish arrived. Moche claimed that as the lice multiplied on his body, so would the human population living in the valley. Here are two representations of the same figure. One has 3 lice on the body, while on the other, the lice are replaced by human forms. Even the famous Moche erotic pots are best explained by the historical accounts. Several Spanish chroniclers mention that sodomy and sexual orgies were a part of the religious practices of the coastal Indians. It turns out that nearly every Moche design implies much more than the worldly activity it outwardly portrays. In fact, Moche art is similar to many forms of religious art. Religious art often deals with a few important events which are illustrated using conventional figures. The nativity scene of the Christian tradition is a typical example of religious art, since it consists of well-known elements that symbolize a major event in Christianity, the birth of a Messiah. The main figures in the Christmas story are instantly recognized by their characteristic poses and garments. Even the secondary figures are readily identified by personal symbols. An elaborate nativity will include angels, wise men, shepherds, and animals in addition to the Holy Family. Alternatively, an artist may capture the whole spirit of the Nativity with a simpler version. The infant Christ alone can represent the entire event. After studying more than 100,000 examples of Moche art, we now believe that the Moche artists probably depicted less than 15 basic events. One that occurs over and over is the ritual presentation of goblets. Although its full meaning is still unclear, we can treat the forms in this scene the same way we did those in the Nativity. The presentation scene always has two central figures, and, like Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in the Nativity, these central figures can be recognized easily once you know their poses and garments. The figure who presents the goblet is regularly shown holding a disc to symbolize his position, while the figure who usually receives the goblet has rays emanating from his head. An elaborate example of the presentation scene will also include several secondary characters. Each, like shepherd or wise man, has its traditional clothing and posture. Bound and naked prisoners are always accompanied by human or feline captors. Like their Christian counterparts, the Moche artists used simplified versions to show the same event. Here, the entire presentation scene is represented by the two main figures at the top, and beneath them, a prisoner with his feline captor and a bird warrior. Again, in this scene, a prisoner with his captor and a warrior join the two main figures to express the whole occurrence. Since we now know that Moche art deals with certain specific events, we can look at it with new understanding. When we realize that this is a representation of the bound prisoner with feline captor from the presentation scene, the two figures and their activity take on a new meaning. And because we can recognize this fragmentary mural as a version of the presentation scene, we are able to reconstruct the missing portions. For 7 centuries, the Moche kingdom ruled the Peruvian north coast. But long before the Spanish conquistadores marched into Peru, Moche society had crumbled to be replaced by other civilizations that eventually developed into the Inca Empire, which greeted the Spanish. For us, the unique achievement of Moche culture was its ceramic art and the spiritual values it seems to imply. Still, we will never know everything we might wish to know about these people. We may never know the exact nature of any Moche event. We may never know what this woman said when she spoke to her child. We may never know the name of any Moche warrior. And what were the powers of this deity? No matter what we may learn, we still remain in awe of the Moche artists. Yet, our techniques have given us new insights. They have allowed us not only to explore the world in which the Moche lived, but also to discover the unique and wonderful way in which they perceived that world.